Ever since the release of Poppy Playtime, Mascot Horror has been on a rise, but Ban is probably what set this current era of the genre, both the slop and the recent turnaround. Not to credit any of those games with creating the genre itself, Menti Ink Machine is a genre codifier for a reason, but ever since Poppy, Mascot Horror has not been a genre that comes to mind when thinking of the greats. With that being said, I actually like Mascot Horror, at least the good entries, but I've been seeing a shift in the genre. Settings almost always some kids' plays. Parkour is an aspect, and I feel like the worst being the actual complete lack of story present in the game itself. I'll give Ban this. At least it has an actual plot and characters. Even things like lore, past your theory bait, has become increasingly rare, as Mascot Horror is released at such a rate that nothing coherent can be made in set time span. But instead of sitting here and thinking about a perfect world where the genre would produce games I love, I decided instead to make my own Mascot Horror game. Back in late March 2023, that is. Yeah, I'm a bit late, and my original goal was solely to create a Mascot Horror game that was, better than this. But eventually, I fell in love with the project. I learned Unity and was starting to get the hang of things when other projects beckoned my call. So I just kept doodling and thinking up concepts while also trying and failing to make character models. But one day I decided enough was enough and began true production of the game. I've been trying and failing to make a script for this video many times, but now that I'm pausing development due to having finished a game jam and needing rest, I figured it'd be the perfect time to get a coherent deadlog. Gameplay may be the most important part of any game, but the concept you're distorting and the characters you make are the building blocks of the genre. So, what have I got? First off, I decided to distort good old comics. The Garfields, the Big Nates, the Peanuts, etc. The concept was decided since I'm a comic artist myself and spent a lot of my childhood, and now, reading comic strip volumes. As for those mascots, I didn't want to go into the direction a lot of mascot horror games do, where mascots are just kind of blobs. So I decided to make the in-universe comics about bugs in an office setting. You've got your main character, Eddie the Bee, and his co-workers. Not the most original concept, especially since the office aspect came from a suggestion from a friend, but I still find it a believable enough concept to have been in printing. The individual personalities of the characters are something I'll mostly leave to you to guess for now, but still, I will say that Eddie and Harry are friends. Eddie and Elizabeth are somewhat enemies. Elizabeth doesn't really get along with anybody in the main group. Agnes loves everybody a bit too much. And yeah, all those things will be relevant when I make their real life counterparts. And speaking of that, I know, don't worry, gameplay is next. But what's a horror game without the horror? Well, a horror game can't be a horror game without the game, but like with mascots, I won't be too specific about this due to wanting to keep things a surprise, but I've decided to go on a much more medical side since I want to concentrate on the concept of turning people into mascots. I'm gonna try to avoid jump scares, so it's not a promise that I won't use them to accentuate a scare, but I certainly won't be using them as the main source. I also do want to do some psychological horror, but I'm very socially inept, so I'm not sure how well I can play that on the mind. When making this game, I want to avoid a lot of tropes present in a lot of mascot horror games. Having a main object to use is fine. I'm planning to do some cool stuff with the flashlight used in later chapters, and maybe even in this one. But I think having a gimmick for the sake of it doesn't do any wonders for the gameplay. And besides that, I feel like parkour is absolutely useless. I mean, it's a horror game. Not to say that it doesn't work, like ever, but you know. Now, I also feel like the very tedious and monotonous puzzles I see in a lot of games feel more like a chore than actual gameplay. I want to see some variety in styles. There's so many options for gameplay, yet they're all the same. During pre-production, I researched regular horror games very frequently. Your Resident Evils, Amnesias, and Dead Space, all that stuff. I found that a pretty frequent element of gameplay outside of combat was puzzles and resource management. In this chapter, you'll be in a pretty controlled part of the environment. Some idea for resource management being medication won't be shown that well, but puzzles are absolutely going to be a super important part of the gameplay. I know. I just criticized the other mascot horror games for always using puzzles as their main form of gameplay. But that puzzles is in quotation marks for a reason. Plus, I'm using a pretty different form of puzzles than what's usually in these games. I think I want to implement a bit of combat as well, but I'm not sure if it'd be considered combat due to it not being punching or shooting. Though I think it'll count a little. The entire game is mostly going to be resource management and puzzles, though, since I want a game to have a permanent entity. Another part of the identity, like with any other game of this nature, is the story. I put a slash in there because I do think there is a difference. Story does involve plot, but it also involves characters, environment, and background information. Meanwhile, the plot is just what happens in the media itself. It's called plot beats for a reason. This is the part where I really can't dive that deep. But since the story is the thing I find most important in a linear game like this, apart from the gameplay, I will share more than the average dev would at this stage. Alright, so meet our protagonist Ian. He's the main guy who writes the comic It's Bugging Me for the company Creepy Crawly Comics, until he tries quitting his job, that is. However, they didn't really like that, so they brought him to a facility where the company was experimenting on people to create real versions of the comic characters. And then they turned Ian into a not that bad attempt at the main character of the comic, so now he has to escape. As you can tell, this is basically a scenario where the question is, what if you were in the shoes of one of the employees that got turned into mascots? Apart from that, I really wanted the location you're set in to be concrete and believable, so the facility is going to be a printing press that was bought out and then shut down by the CCC to be used as an area for the experiments. That way, I get to really explore a solid area and play around with things. Just not in the first chapter. I mean, look at the area it's taking place in. I know it's tiny, but I will try to jam-pack it with enough content to at least make it 30 to 45 minutes. I don't want the printing press to be comically large, so I'm trying the best I can to limit the area you can explore per chapter. The next chapters will be bigger for certain, though. So, now on to the more logistical side of things. First off, I know for sure I'm going to be making the game cost something. I need to pay off the Steam fee, and I also want to have enough funds to actually hire people to help me out. I know some people complain about Mascot Horror's game being pretty short, yet costing money, but I promise that it won't be expensive, and I'll try my best to make that short time as fun and replayable as possible. Secondly, due to the story's nature, I'm on the fence on whether or not to hire voice actors during Chapter 1's production or after, because there would be a lot of dialogue to record, and I don't think it's fair to hire voice actors for free when the product is being paid for. That being said, I know that acting voices in an update will be very jarring, and first impressions are very important. To any voice actors out there, let me know what you think about this dilemma. I want voice acting, but if I get money out of this, then so should the people who gave me their labor. Third, release dates. I'm hoping to have this released in 2024, but that isn't 100%, as I'm a beginner game dev that's still pretty new to programming, game design, and 3D modeling. The 3D modeling is going pretty well, though, and I'm planning to make most of the models in the game myself, especially since I have a more unique style present in the models. Lastly, I'm going to make sure to keep you guys updated periodically, but I'm trying to keep things a surprise till at least a trailer. I'm also planning on releasing a teaser before August, so that's a goal I've set myself. Hopefully, I can be much, much earlier than that. With that being said, thank you so much for listening to me ramble about this project, and I hope you have a nice day. Bye!